Is Amon a communist? Now, I'm not asking, is Amon a red flag waving, you have nothing to lose but your chains, bring up the guillotine? I mean, is he meant to metaphorically represent communism? You may have seen CanSkittles's video critiquing Amon's thematic representation of communism. It's a good video, and I can understand why you might make this connection. There are a lot of parallels between the equalists and communists at a glance, but I don't think Amon was ever meant to represent communism. There are glaring ideological differences between them, and I think it's a lot more complicated than that.
I believe I have your attention, people of YouTube. For centuries, benders have possessed an unnatural advantage over ordinary people. With it, they have exploited you all. But there is another issue plaguing our city. You haven't joined Tim's Patreon and Discord, but your chance is now. The revolution has begun!
First, let's look at the similarities. The most obvious being the desire for equality. The giant surrealist posters of Amon recall the propaganda posters of the Soviet Union and Maoist China. They both use red as their dominant colour. Equalists at various points refer to one another as brothers and sisters, in the same way a communist might refer to others as comrade. It takes place in an early 20th century era, and Amon's rhetoric juxtaposes a ruling class against an oppressed class that must rise up, and Amon takes something from that ruling class to attain equality. They're bending, like a communist might take the wealth of the bourgeoisie. There are also a number of other, more subtle parallels that you might have missed too. The famous 1917 October Russian Revolution was called a bloodless coup because almost nobody died in the process of taking over. A relatively small group of rebels seized all of the crucial infrastructure in the capital city. The railways, post office, communications, power stations, government buildings, and, well, the revolution was won. The equalist coup in Republic City actually follows a very similar pattern.
Chief, all river rescue ships have been sabotaged.
What? Chief Saikon. Tenzin, am I glad to see you. I was afraid you'd been captured too.
I'm the only council member left. What's the status?
Chief, the phone lines just went dead.
They take the power station, the radio towers, and kidnap members of the ruling council to paralyze the city's infrastructure. It is, too, a relatively bloodless coup. But most of these are aesthetic similarities more than they are ideological similarities, and a lot of them can be put down to Amon's connections to populism more than a connection to communism specifically. Populism is a political strategy that pits an elite class who control society against an oppressed people who are oppressed and make up most of society and must rise up and take back control. Naturally, communism's juxtaposition of the wealthy bourgeoisie with the proletariat fits quite neatly with this rhetorical strategy, but it's not at all exclusive to it. Nazis used populist rhetoric to juxtapose a Jewish elite with the average ethnic German, while figures like Trump have used it to juxtapose coastal elites or the media with the average worker. Equalism is going to share this rhetorical strategy in how Amon speaks and frames issues because equalism and communism are both just populist ideas. I do think it's fair to say that Amon's posters recall communist propaganda in colour and design, but here's the thing. It's okay to invoke imagery from things in our world without necessarily being that thing. The Empire in Star Wars uses Nazi imagery to invoke certain connotations, feelings, but that doesn't mean that it's a one-to-one allegory. Darth Vader having a redemption at the end isn't saying Hitler's right-hand man Heinrich Himmler eventually redeemed himself. No! Amon invokes communist revolutionary imagery to give us the feeling of an underclass rising up and the status quo being dramatically brought to an end. But that doesn't mean that everything he is an allegory for communism in the 20th century. I think a lot of people latched onto the term equality as a dog whistle for communism and took it too quickly as a direct metaphor. Despite equality being the rallying call of a number of movements that are not communist, and a number of sharp ideological differences between Amon's equalism and communism. For one, Amon focuses on bending as an impurity which he must cleanse.
You will now be cleansed of your impurity.
Which, yikes, and don't worry, we will get to that. This may be why the propaganda shares commonalities with Nazi and Spanish nationalist posters too. One even bears the slogan, Amon is the solution, so it's not just communist imagery that they're drawing on. Secondly, bending as an advantage someone has is very different to wealth, which is why CanSkittles rightly conclude that if it is a metaphor for wealth, it doesn't work, and it leads us to some bizarre thematic conclusions. People can be born into wealth, sure, but it is not an inherent trait of who they are. Taking wealth is not destroying a part of who a person is, unlike taking their bending. That's why Korra is so afraid of it. She's defined herself by her bending for so long, and the writers, Mike and Brian, seem very aware of this. Amon was interesting to us because it's something we can all relate to. I think a lot of who I am and how I identify myself is tied up in what I do as far as art and writing in the show. What would I do one day if I couldn't draw or write? Everyone has a unique ability or personality that is part of his or her persona. I think it's fascinating to explore what makes us who we are. Is it our jobs, our hobbies, our families? There's no simple answer, of course. Bending is not compared to wealth or anything that people would consider close to wealth here. The writers seem very aware that this story is about losing part of what makes you who you are, your abilities, personality, your interests, and Amon is framed as someone who is designed to take those personal things away from us. The story framework itself only works because it's aimed at critiquing a kind of collectivism that communism is not critiqued for, defining and demonizing people by their immutable, unchangeable traits, namely whether they are non-benders or benders. This is why Tarlok and Amon are paralleled. You might not realize, but Tarlok is actually given more screen time as a villain than Amon is. He dominates the first 2/3 of the season. He oppresses non-benders, he cuts off their power supply, he imposes curfews on them, he arrests them for peacefully protesting purely because he associates them with the Equalist because they are non-benders.
This is an equalist rally. There's nothing innocent about it.
They're not equalists. They're just normal people who want their rights back.
They are the enemy. Round up all these equalists!
Both Amon and Tarlok are shown to be targeting groups of people because of their immutable traits, regardless of whether they personally oppressed others. There's actually a fundamental line from Korra explaining this here.
You're just as bad as Amon!
This comparison only works because the writers wanted to portray Tarlok and Amon as doing the same thing on some level. Rather than solving society's problems by talking and empathizing, they target others with violence for things they can't control, which fits quite nicely with Korra's arc of not learning to rely on violence. Whether this is a fair comparison because Amon is trying to address genuine problems with society while Tarlok is trying to take power for himself is a different discussion. The point is, saying that communists target rich people for things they can't control was not and never has been a critique of communist philosophy, even from its opponents. I mean, the writers never indicated they were dumb enough to believe that wealth is an inherent, unchangeable part of who you are. In fact, they indicate quite the opposite in that quote I read out before, that it's about your skills, your interests, and your personality. That's what Amon is targeting. However, benders are a minority in their world population, so after spending 3 seasons dealing with a war of cultures that was largely element versus element, turning our attentions to the relations between benders and non-benders gave us a fresh story to tell. And with Republic City being a melting pot where different kinds of benders are mingling, the differences there became less about disparate cultures and more about the haves and the have-nots, which in this case is about having a physical advantage and ultimately power. While the writers do see commonalities between class and wealth relations and bender-non-bender relations, both leading to a have and have-nots dynamic, they recognize that this is rooted in inherent physical capabilities leading to power. Even if there are some rhetorical or aesthetic similarities, the issues of benders versus non-benders are unique to the world at hand. Our world doesn't really have inherent physical advantages as pervasive as bending. Someone might be smarter, stronger, more attractive, and these will afford them some advantages, but people cannot as easily draw lines to define themselves by these immutable strengths into groups, and people have the ability to buff themselves up, to get smarter, to match them for the most part. The question Amon is concerned with, how do we ensure equality between those who are more genetically privileged and those less genetically privileged, just simply is not a question communism tackles. Whereas philosophically, communists are concerned with the existence of excessive wealth and thus power, because they believe that having so much wealth itself depends on others having none. Amon's philosophy is concerned with the use of power. Communists view wealth as a consequence of exploitation, while Amon sees exploitation as a moral consequence of the inherent power of benders. People having bending abilities does not depend on others having none, but the inherent inequality means that abuse is so rampant that the only solution is to remove it entirely. With all of this, I find it really hard to buy that wealth was ever the intended metaphor. I think the closest Amon might come to a critique of communism is that movements aimed at ensuring equal outcomes can go too far and end up undermining people's individuality by forcing them into places they would not choose, which is a valid criticism. Kane Skittles also point out that Amon being revealed as a bender at the end could be a reference to how communist leaders often end up living rich and lavish lifestyles at the expense of their people, that the promise of redistributing the wealth was a lie. But I doubt this too. The metaphor just doesn't fit, because the show treats Amon as wholly genuine.
But I think Amon truly believes bending is the source of all evil in the world.
No scenes ever suggest that he is somehow inauthentic. In the moment where Korra confronts him privately, this would usually be the story beat where the villain reveals,
Yes, I'm going to be the only bender left, and then nobody will be able to stop me!
But Amon says nothing of the sort. On the other hand, Tarlok has a moment exactly like this, where he confesses to manufacturing conflict to gain more power. This is a critique of how dictators come to power. While Amon does lie about his past and true identity, if this were, say, a reference to Stalin lying about his true aims, Amon would do something that indicates he has an ulterior motive, like Tarlok, but he doesn't. In contrast to some communist leaders, his lies in no way make life worse for his supporters. Amon carries out his promises as best he can. Amon's lie is just rhetoric and framing, and that's just politics. So yes, Amon and Tarlok are paralleled, but their goals are not treated narratively as morally equivalent. Tarlok is shown to be disingenuous, only doing bad things for his own selfish gain, while Amon is totally authentic, shown to be doing bad things for the good of others. In fact, those flashbacks that we see later on in the series try to help us empathize with why he's doing them. Having the revolution fall apart once Amon is exposed could be read as saying that the whole thing was based on a lie, but I think this is more likely that it's just because of the rushed writing of the 12-episode season they were given, rather than being an intended metaphor for saying that communist regimes are based on lies. No. So if Amon doesn't represent communism, the question becomes, does Amon represent anything? I don't think there can be a perfect parallel, to be honest, but he could be called a Rawlsian, embodying John Rawls's two principles of justice. 1. Everyone deserves the same rights and liberties, and 2, inequalities are only justified insofar as they benefit the most disadvantaged members of society. For Amon, the most disadvantaged are the non-benders. While Rawls was talking about material inequalities, Amon is still dealing with a kind of inequality related to this. Rawls was concerned with the absolute welfare rather than the relative welfare of the most disadvantaged. In other words, whatever system ensures the best life for the least among us is the one we should use, even if it decreases the welfare of more advantaged groups. Amon believes eradicating bending will improve the lives of non-benders by removing the threat of violence and coercion more than bending makes life better for non-benders in construction, power generation, transport, etc. To Amon, the political arrangement where bending is outlawed and removed on principle is the system that will create the best life for non-benders. But Amon's rhetoric actually focuses more on the first principle, that everyone is entitled to the same rights and liberties. Rawls pointed out that people do not have the same rights and liberties if inequalities make some people more able to exercise those rights. I don't know, for example, maybe if rich people could fund their own political campaigns, and so exercise more control. Inequalities that violate the first principle are not allowed, and Amon has the same critique in Republic City. He points out how the government is biased towards benders, and the show makes a point of Tarlok ignoring the rights of non-bending citizens, because what are they gonna do? The rights to protest, to freedom of speech, to a fair trial, to the presumption of innocence, all the while the Avatar does not defend those rights. Non-benders may have equal rights by law, but bending means that they cannot exercise those rights as easily.
You and your children will no longer have to walk the streets afraid.
They have the right to move and to speak freely in the streets as benders do, but they do so in fear. And to Amon, the exercise of equal rights is incompatible with having bending. It's still a prison, even if it's an incredibly well-built one. But something really does warp Amon's philosophy here away from Rawls, and that's his framing of bending as an impurity.
Those men were supposedly the best in the bending world. And yet it only took a few moments for me to cleanse them of their impurity.
This is distinctly not Rawlsian and not communist, and it brings a pseudo-racial element into Amon's ideas. The closest we might come to explaining this is Strasserism. Strasserism is an off-branch of Nazism which put a lot more emphasis on the socialist part of National Socialist, and it emphasized economic anti-Semitism above all else. It played heavily into the racist trope that Jews controlled the financial world and were leeches on society, not producing anything of value unlike the working German. To be clear, this was not true then, and it is not true today. Like Nazism, it employed a populist rhetoric by pitting the quote Jewish elite against the quote working class Germans. But a key difference was that whereas Hitler's Nazism emphasized a clash of races or cultures, Strasserism emphasized class politics by conflating class with racial politics. Strasserites argued that the Jewish people were at the heart of capitalism's problems, exploiting the working class, unnaturally impure, manipulative, and deceitful, making them richer. It's a populist ideology that classifies Jews as a quote economic elite because of their supposed inherent traits. Obviously, Amon describing benders as impure rings a lot more familiar here. Slogans like "Amon is the solution" is an interesting choice of words and recalls fascistic talking points. However, again, this fails as a one-to-one analogy because Strasserism is based on a racist lie. Jewish people are not naturally deceitful, not naturally manipulative, nor do they unfairly occupy places of wealth and power because of their immutable traits. And if you believe that, get the hell out. In contrast, the writers fully acknowledge that benders do have an unfair advantage because of their inherent abilities, and it manifests in power, wealth, and status, which Amon critiques in the series. The similarity here is that Amon does seem to view the class-wealth conflict in Republic City as the same thing as this kinda pseudo-racial conflict between benders and non-benders. Gangs extort non-benders for money, society idolizes pro-benders in the arena, and the governing council is entirely made of benders. There's even an explicit critique of Korra as the Avatar, who uses her powers, violence, and threats to get what she wants.
You're using your power to oppress and intimidate people.
Isn't that what you came here to do?
You're just as bad as Amon.
Threats like this are just something non-benders aren't able to do so much. Korra's arc in Season 1 actually serves to prove Amon right, as it shows how prone the Avatar is in particular to oppressing others. There's a distinct moment where Korra's display of power isn't awe-inspiring or epic, but dark, destructive, and villainous.
Still think I'm a half-baked Avatar?
Korra doesn't even give a care to how much property damage she causes and thinks herself above the law. She is what Amon is talking about. It's also implied that the Avatar is going to be biased towards benders like herself when non-benders are being rounded up.
You're our Avatar too!
All of these are critiques of bending in the Avatar world, and not wealth in ours. And forcing them to be a critique of wealth makes the story weaker than it is. Like pretending Animal Farm is a critique of animal cruelty means of course you're gonna arrive at some strange conclusions. Amon's philosophy is a strange mix of Rawlsian justice and extreme Strasserite theory without fully fitting either of them. He has a non-Rawlsian focus on purity, and he lacks the strongman nationalism that also defines Strasserism. There is no real parallel to our world, because the issues in a world with bending come from a different place to issues in ours, and so do their solutions. Fundamentally, I think viewing Amon this way makes him more fascinating, more complex, and the story much more compelling. But that's all for me. Social media, etc. Come follow me down below. Love you all, stay nerdy, and I'll see you in the future.